Zionist youth movement. Youth are surprisingly active in politics. People really care about stuff here. They're very, very passionate. They will go out of their way to do stuff. That guy back there painted the whole front of his house because he likes the president. He's covered his house in statements in support of her. Young people are massively radicalised in terms of what they want to contribute. People do get very into stuff, and it's in a way that maybe a little bit more unusual for apathetic Western nations, perhaps. But part of the reason people do get massively into stuff is because Argentina is a very young democracy in its own sense. I mean, democracy can only really be counted from 1984, and within that very short space of time, they've had to endure the kind of the aftermath of genocide and an economic crash. So there's been a lot of things that have brought people together. The genocide, though, I think is probably one of the most far-reaching things that people probably. Have you heard of the Madres? Okay, so the Madres were the mothers of these kids who actually mobilised and formed almost a kind of a political organisation, which was essentially built out of women just wanting to know where the hell their kids had gone to. The thing with the disappearances was it was a kind of a peculiar form of psychological torture, that people just disappeared. They weren't killed, they weren't executed, they weren't held in concentration camps, they weren't arrested. One day they just weren't there anymore, and no one would claim any responsibility for what happened to them. So people were frantic because nobody knew. There were kind of rumours going around, maybe they escaped the country, maybe they were in hiding, but it was a sort of a form of torture that people just had to deal with the fact that no one knew what was happening. People heard of the grandmothers in Plaza de Mayo. So this is like, I mean, for those who haven't, as well as the horror of people having their kids disappear, this kind of an ongoing thing now where the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo were mothers whose daughters were abducted while pregnant, and there's a question mark about what happened to their babies. Their babies were invariably delivered by forced cesarean section when their mothers were then thrown out of planes, and then the babies were given away to people who are sympathetic to the dictatorship. There are people now who are finding out in their kind of late 20s that their parents aren't actually their parents colluded with the dictatorship that murdered their parents. There's still this kind of ongoing process that what happened 30 years ago is still very, very relevant to kind of contemporary politics. A lot of contemporary politics is also framed in terms of what happened 30 years ago. There's the people who are on the right side of things 30 years ago and the people who are on the wrong side of things. So the Camper are kind of one of the organisations who do sort of, they put the dictatorship and the genocide very much in the forefront of their campaigns. This piece here is a mural saying the 30,000 more present than ever. So 30,000 people disappeared during that time. And the mural itself is of Christian Caretti, who was a student activist. He was kind of vocal in his support of things when he was 15 in school. He then went on to the university where he was vocal in support of other things. And at 22 he disappeared one day. He was too vocal about things and he was deemed to be subversive, so he was removed. This is kind of a mural. Again, 22, you're not really much of a political contender at 22. You're also not much of a political contender at 15, but people still disappeared at that age. The youngest went back to about 12. Kids at 12 being pulled out of their beds at night and disappearing because they spoke out for too much. So there's a kind of an idea that you need to visualise things, you need to confront people with it. This mural is on us, what they did was to divide it into about 80 different sections, with his family and friends all painting one section of the mural, and his 5-year-old granddaughter painting the bottom section down there. So this is kind of, I don't know, it's interesting. There has been a lot of almost like a need to represent things through public art, through art in galleries. This idea that art for art's sake is just a waste of time in Argentina. It has to assess like what has happened in the past. It has to have a political component to it. And I think there's almost been like a tolerance to street art has built up because, for better or worse, people can remember what it was like when their streets had nothing in them and what that represented when you couldn't speak out, when you were terrified to tell your kids anything in case they repeated it in public and they disappeared. So this all kind of like this flourishing of politics, of art, of activism, of graffiti, of doodles, of I love you, of I hate you, of you are gay, of graffiti style murals, of, I don't know, memorials. It all kind of exists in public space because one way or another it's a sign of a different society. Argentina has moved on and there is kind of a celebration of the freedom of expression that's maybe protected a little bit more vigorously than the rights of individual property owners to have pristine property at all times. There's actually this tribute there to the Madres, the kind of this iconic image of the headscarf up here. So the image of the headscarf became sort of like this symbol. The headscarf itself wasn't a headscarf headscarf, it was a baby cloth or a baby blanket which had the name and signals on it. Because you can really identify yourself as belonging to a movement, it's quite a good way to be anonymous in a crowd. So if you have a headscarf on, you're just a woman in a headscarf. But when you're 2,000 women all in headscarves, suddenly you start becoming a political force. But you can sort of appear and disappear at will. Once you're one woman on her own with a headscarf, doesn't represent anything. So it became this sort of iconic representation of the madre, so you continue to be a political force. If you go anywhere near Plaza de Mayo, you'll see this image of the headscarves like dotted out throughout the city. And one more piece, come around the corner.